I'm Jason Harmon, and this is API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. Welcome back to API Intersection podcast. Hot topic today in the API space, API security, right? We hear stories, seems like every other week, about some kind of API related exploit that happens. And as we know, APIs seem to be in the front of all the software now, and software is in front of all the things. So it's certainly a problem du jour. So we got, I think, a fantastic guest to help us address this subject, as certainly in our day jobs at Stoplight, it's not always the thing we're best at. So we've got Giora Enga from Neosec. So Giora, tell us a little bit about yourself. Oh, and by the way, my often co-host here, Anna, here again, and thank you for that. So Giora, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you for having me today. I'm Giora. I'm a founder and CEO of a company called Neosec in the API security space. Previously in my previous life, I started as more on the offensive side. Then I kind of invented the area called XDR in cybersecurity. It's more on the enterprise security side. And now in recent years,
I'm going to pick on you, Giora.
Yeah.
Every time I talk security, guys, in API design, acronyms are our enemy. Because it's, there's implied meaning. So what the heck is XDR for listeners?
Yeah, XDR is basically the ability to detect and respond threats on, endpoints and servers and machines. This is, kind of what replaced antiviruses in modern enterprise environments these days. So interestingly, and I think, the enterprise security space is kind of, very well known to security people, but application security and APIs are a very new frontier. And everything seems to be happening there right now. So that's kind of what brought me to that space a few years ago.
Cool. Well, I certainly have seen that same kind of trend. I feel like the history of security around kind of applications is generally has been thought as it's the network boundary, right? We control the network and everything's fine. But because of the way that APIs seem to drive deeper into the infrastructure and in a more automatable way, it's opened up a new kind of vector of threats. So, I mean, what are you guys starting to look at to grapple with these things?
So I think I'll start with the fact that from an attacker's perspective, things are very different today compared to 10 years ago. We used to hear about all these breaches where somebody compromised one of the employees' devices and, laterally moved inside the network and, found some servers in your data center. Today, things are very different. If you look at any organization, even kind of, large organizations, everything that they build today is application environments and APIs that are by design exposed to the outside because they need to expose some kind of service or partnership or something like that. So all of a sudden, you're kind of exposing everything to the outside by design. And from a security perspective, most security teams don't even have an idea of what is the inventory of APIs, where to start from. And so on one hand, it poses many new challenges. On the other hand, it's more structured than before. It's not just isolated servers that pop up in different places. So there's, I think there's hope, to do it better and more holistically this time.
So I think in my world, at least around kind of API stuff, it seems like there's always the focus on kind of the engineering side of things, but I'm curious from kind of more the business side of, how this is invested in, how it's looked in, and maybe some of the differences between the kinds of API connectivity and relationships that go on. Do you see that there are kind of differences there?
Yeah, I mean, it looks very different on the security side. First, because the security team doesn't really develop the API, so they're kind of one step removed from the process. But it's more than that. Even the developers that develop the code of the APIs, they don't see the API actually used in practice, in production so much. Most of the development lifecycle happens before it hits production, and then there are very few people that even see what happens in production. Typically these are the DevOps people. But DevOps is more focused on the infrastructure. It's not necessarily thinking or they don't have the tools to look into what's going on inside the application, how it's used, and in some cases being abused, right? So I think that the problem starts with with the lack of visibility on how these APIs are used. These APIs that open that portal to our core business, how they're used in practice.
Yeah. So what I mean, and I see this too. Like DevOps folks get a call and go, "Hey, the API is broken," and they're like, "Okay, like the cluster is running, right? What else do I do?" So, like, what do you see bridging the gap between kind of the more infrastructure operation side of things versus kind of the development world around APIs?
So I think I'll use a typical stack that that many companies use. So typically you have some kind of you know uh, gateway to the outside, can be a CDN or something of that kind, and then you have an API gateway that is typically some infrastructure that you use internally to manage your APIs. And that API gateway is another layer of proxy, typically that has some policies and some configuration. But yeah, and by the way, the API gateway is maintained by the dev or DevOps team. I mean, it's more on the dev side, part of the operation of the API. Now, the problem is that even if you implement an API gateway, you don't necessarily have an inventory of all the APIs. You just have a configuration that routes some domains in a certain way and so on. But you can do some rate limiting, that's fine. But beyond that, you don't really have an inventory of what actually the APIs are. So even on the developer side, unless you're the developer that specifically wrote the code of a specific API, you don't really have a picture of what is the inventory of these APIs. Now, if you think about it from the security side, they may have access to some logs from some components, but without more context, it's really hard to know what to do with that data. Especially if you don't have the inventory, you don't even know what to look for. So this is really the starting point. I think for many teams, it's really all about discovering APIs, and this is kind of a term that is recently used in this context. And it means basically creating an inventory, documenting it, and making sure that our inventory is up to date, because these APIs change all the time. That's kind of the first step.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's an implicit thing said in there, which is important to point out. Broadly speaking, I think in the testing world, this has been a theme for a long time, and in a lot of other practices, it's starting now. Is like, how do we shift things left? Mm-hmm. So if we assume that the right side is you've got an application running in production, and the left side is ideation, right? You're going to go create something that early as you can, take stock of what it is that you mean to build, and to your point, kind of build that catalog, that inventory. I mean, certainly in our day to day at Stoplight, that's always hot on our minds. We kind of end up being that source of truth a lot of times. But I mean, what other kind of tools, techniques, approaches do you see that it's kind of doing that the right way? And I guess honestly, like, how do you guys at Neosec fit into that picture?
Yeah. So I mean, typically on the developer side, when you develop modern microservices, RESTful APIs and so on, you use Open API specs to describe them. Sometimes you can even do it before writing the API, so that you can actually agree on the interface before. So that is useful for a lot of different purposes, and also good for documentation purposes. The reality, though, is that over time the APIs shift and change, and that documentation doesn't always change with the APIs. So the first step that we help solve is creating that inventory dynamically and always comparing to the well-known documentation. So if we find something that is not already documented, we can flag it as something that is not documented. Typically, I mean, what we see in practice is that typically there are whole services that are not documented, because I mean there's typically more focus on documenting APIs that are supposed to be used by other developers, but less focus on documenting, for example, admin interfaces or other interfaces that are really inherent, but not necessarily needed by others. So there is less focus on that. Or older APIs, if it's not RESTful, it's typically hard to document in the same way. The tools don't really work the same way. Even though it's possible, it's kind of hard. So we take the approach of, by observing the traffic, we can actually recreate all the documentation and also compare it to existing documentation. Then just to kind of complete the picture, we also look for vulnerabilities, misimplementations, misconfigurations and deployment issues with the APIs. and also look for behavioral anomalies. So this is kind of monitoring how the APIs are being used by the clients. Typically, these are external clients, but it can also be east-west APIs. And finding cases where the APIs are abused or not used, in a good way, which can lead to data leaks and other types of problems.
I'd love to hear more about those types of problems, right? Well, we always talk about how a well-designed API prevents some of those security issues, but we need to talk more about what those are so developers understand the risks.
Yeah. So maybe I'll start with something that is almost an oxymoron. I think, well-developed RESTful APIs, like, let's say you develop a new environment based on microservices, you do it right. So you actually develop a bunch of microservices that that give very good access to the data. You don't want to create too much logic, on these APIs. The APIs are merely a layer to access these data objects and create these different data manipulations.
Opinion.
Yeah.
I think I take issue with that one, but fair enough. I think it's that's generally the assumption.
In general strokes, bear with me for a second here, right?
No, it's fine. Go ahead. I'm just messing with you.
Yeah. Naturally, you want to create the APIs in a generic way, in generic enough so that they can be used for different nuances of how you want to expose the APIs. And of course, you have different permissions and roles and different ways of administering the authorization model. But eventually, your APIs are really more like an object model. But by the way, the most extreme use case is GraphQL, right? I mean, you have an open SQL query, SQL-like query interface, and it's very useful because then your client code can shift and change, and you don't need to change the APIs all the time. So this is like on one hand, this is kind of the driving force. So then the most common abuse cases are actually ones that don't look like abuse. Basically, it's using the APIs in a way that is technically okay. It's authorized, it's not using a vulnerability even. But if you're scraping data, let's say you're accessing too many objects, and sometimes, by the way, it's a mistake. Let's say let's say you're some kind of a medical provider or medical payer, and one of your partnerships is another hospital that needs to access the data in order to provide treatment, right? So, I mean, they could implement it in a way that actually takes all the records to their side, does some processing, and then does something with the data, or they can just retrieve one specific record that they need. So of course, a simple mistake like that is beyond your control as the API author, can really expose the data. So these are typically a lot of cases that we see are these cases. Of course, if your other party gets compromised, then the APIs can also be used against you. Like if you have a payment platform, and let's say you're a payment provider and you have merchants transacting on your platform, then if one of the merchants gets compromised, then all the data and transactions that at least that merchant has access to can be compromised, reversed, or sabotaged, or and so on. So that's kind of a clear use case where the APIs technically are used in a way that is authorized and clean, but because of account takeover, it can be used against you.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I've harped on for years that I think is a pretty good expression of this example that's actually design related in how you think about the API is like sequential identifiers that are in the database being exposed in your design. Mm-hmm. In the event that someone's compromised, you've just built an easy way to sort of write a very simple script to just roll through and grab them all. So are you looking for things like that, like sequential kind of, N+1 calls to go grab a whole tree of data?
This is a common vulnerability that we call enumerable parameters. I mean, this is kind of a fancy name for basically saying that most of the parameters that you use that way should not be sequential, that are easy to guess. That's on top of other controls that other authorization controls that you need to implement. But typically typically when you use values like that, it's better that they're not sequential.
Yeah.
But still, I'll make it even harder because in a lot of platforms, if you are the right client that is supposed to have access to these objects, there are typically APIs that would give you the list of objects that you have access to, because of good reasons, right? So then, like if your credentials get compromised, then that attacker, that actor can at least get access to your objects. They don't necessarily need to guess the numbers. They already are authorized. They can ask the system for the numbers.
Yep. Which, by the way, for listeners, the easy solution to this is, some form of like UUID, GUID kind of stuff is generally the right answer to avoid, don't put your database identifiers over HTTP, right? It leads to all kinds of bad things. Cool.
Is this a case for putting security type of standards into your style guide?
I would say that, there may be two implications here. One is that there are a lot of security guidelines that you should take into account when designing APIs. But the other side of it is that you need to accept the fact that, because you're designing flexible microservices, you're inherently giving, more access than absolutely needed, for a particular service. I mean, as opposed to monolithic applications that kind of hide all that business logic and and let you do very specific operations, the APIs are inherently exposed a little bit more. And therefore, I think it's not enough to just find vulnerabilities and fix them. You also need to be able to see how the API is being used and take an action if it's used beyond what you think it should be used. Like, for example, if accessing multiple objects is a problem, you need to have good monitoring beyond rate limiting, because rate limiting only takes you that far. People can still access a lot of objects over time. So you need to have some controls to tell you how it's being used, how many objects over time, if it's if there are some anomalies or misuse of the APIs.
Yeah, well said. And I guess some of this there's a predicate here, an idea that we're talking a lot about authorized access to data, which I think in kind of the B2B world and certainly my world and most of my career has always been true. There's certainly another subset out there of like more kind of B2C oriented things that you don't have all those same problems. But like, are there different problems in those kind of spaces?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting that APIs are kind of a technology layer, and it's used both in B2B and B2C use cases. So B2C, just to make it tangible, is typically when you write a web application or a mobile application, you expose APIs that in modern environments you typically expose it as APIs that expose the data into objects, and then there's a layer of like a user interface in web or mobile that accesses these APIs. So these are B2C, and they're naturally over time it's more and more relying on APIs, and we spoke about some of the problems. But in B2B APIs, the client is actually typically another organization and another service that accesses your data. So it's like a headless application in a sense. And B2B APIs actually have more challenges. I wanted to highlight a few of them. One challenge of B2B applications is the fact that there are many more of these. Like imagine that you're a financial services company or whatever type of company you are. Your web applications. You have typically a few. They might be very detailed, but there are a few web applications that are very well known. But B2B interfaces, you can have hundreds and hundreds of them, because every partner that you have is a little bit different. So it brings a lot of nuances. Now, the other one is that when you author client applications, you have that trick of stepping up authorization, like asking somebody to type an SMS code that is sent through a different channel. That way you can make sure that it's actually a person on the other side and that they have access to their phone. But when you author B2B APIs, you actually don't have any control over the client. It's another implementation. You don't even know the exact implementation. And you have to provide them with tokens that work in the background over time. So you can't really revert to to using that trick.
Yeah.
So these are kind of these are common challenges. And by the way, the last challenge that is very common is that, and that is common for microservice environments in general, is that microservices, unlike monolithic applications, can't really have too much of the holistic context. Because they're designed in a way that if a microservice gets an authorized request, it needs to fulfill it. That's how you can create more modularity and more ways of using your APIs. And this is all good design, but it makes it harder to monitor. So that's kind of the need for monitoring comes from there.
Well, I wore my black hat with a stoplight logo in honor of our security discussion today. But what I will say is, I feel like when we get into these discussions around security, it's a big onion that we're all trying to peel. There's so many layers and so many things to think about. Um, and but any closing thoughts for us here on kind of where you guys are going or what folks should think about?
Yeah, I think one of my takeaways is that if you already have some kind of API strategy and an API gateway, that's a great way to start the API security journey. In most organizations, the security team is very much in line with the program, and when it comes to API security, their goal is not to kind of stop you from developing your APIs. The goal is actually to help ensure that the API can be used safely over time and that you can build more and more APIs. So they're actually, from what we learned, the security team is actually interested in in getting access to that data so that they can help even promote the use of gateways and so on. And that visibility that the security team wants actually helps the developers in the end of the day, because if you can have that visibility, you can then see how it's used. You can find even you can even debug your system that way better than you would today, because if your logs are better, if your visibility is better, you can actually do more with the data. So this is a clear case where there is a win-win between the security and developer teams.
Beautiful. Well, the one time I forget to ask the one question I always ask: how do you get started? And Giora, you just had the great enough sense to tell listeners exactly that. So really appreciate your kind of openness and sharing, your expertise on the subject. I know everybody's hungry for learning how to peel the onion of API security. So thanks a lot for being on today. And Anna, thanks for helping co-host as usual.
Anytime.
Thanks for listening. If you have a question you want to ask, look in the description of whichever platform you're viewing or listening on, and there should be a link there so you can go submit a question, and we'll do our best to find out the right answer for you.